Gideon Whitmore slammed his fist on the kitchen table so hard the coffee cups rattled against their saucers. I want him gone by Friday. Nobody argued, nobody dared. At 63, Gideon had buried a son-in-law, survived 2 brutal Montana winters alone, and raised a daughter who still flinched when men raised their voices. His word on this ranch wasn't a suggestion. It was weather. It came whether you wanted it or not. But Helen had been standing at that kitchen window for 30 years. And what she'd seen ride in from that storm 3 weeks ago, a half-frozen stranger cradling a terrified 4-year-old girl against his chest like she was the most important cargo in the world, that wasn't something a man performed. That wasn't something you could fake. She said nothing to Gideon, not yet. But she also didn't forget what she saw. And in this valley, forgetting was a choice. Helen Whitmore had never been much for easy choices. If you've ever watched someone be judged before they were ever truly seen, stay with me. This story is for you. And if it moves you the way it moved me, hit that subscribe button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to know how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The storm came in from the northwest. The way bad news always did, fast, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees and the sky over the Whitmore Ranch had gone the color of an old bruise. Helen had already pulled in the last of the laundry and was working on her second pot of coffee when she heard the sound. Not thunder, not wind snapping at the shutters. Hoofbeats. Slow ones, deliberate. The kind that told you the horse had been running hard for a long time and was now being held back by someone who understood that the last mile mattered. She moved to the window without thinking about it. The rider was coming in from the eastern tree line, which made no sense. There was nothing east of the ranch for 6 miles except canyon country, broken rock, dried creek beds, drop-offs that didn't announce themselves until you were already over them. Nobody rode in from the east, not on a day like this, not on any day really. But this man did, and it wasn't until he got within 100 yards of the yard that Helen saw what he was carrying. A child, small, dark-haired. Her face buried against the man's chest with both arms locked around his neck. His right arm was wrapped completely around her, his left hand managing the reins, and the way his body was angled, tilted just slightly forward, shoulders curved inward, told Helen something she wouldn't have been able to put into words right then. He wasn't just transporting that little girl, he was shielding her. From the wind, from the cold, from whatever she'd already been through. Helen was out the back door before she'd made any conscious decision to move. The man pulled up at the fence line and looked down at her. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed, though weather and hard work had a way of rearranging a man's age, so you were never quite sure. He had 3 days of dark stubble and eyes the color of creek water after a hard rain. Gray-green, not particularly warm, but steady. Steady in a way that told you he didn't spook easily. She wandered out of the canyon mouth, he said. His voice was flat. Not cold, just economical. Like a man who'd learned long ago that words cost something. Found her about 40 minutes back. She was headed for the south drop-off. Helen reached up, and the little girl transferred into her arms without resistance, which meant she'd been held right. Children knew. They always knew. How'd you get to her in time? Happened to be working the east fence. He said it like it was nothing, like 40 minutes of hard riding through pre-storm canyon terrain with a frightened child was just part of a Tuesday. You're Silas, Helen said. Not a question. She knew who he was. Her husband had hired him 11 days ago, and in 11 days she'd learned almost nothing about him, which was itself a kind of information. Yes, ma'am. Come inside, I'll get you coffee. I'll see to the horse first. I was already dismounting before she could answer. She watched him lead the animal toward the barn, watched him pause, check one of the horse's front hooves, adjust the way the saddle was sitting, do 3 small things for the animal before he did one thing for himself. And something settled into place in the back of her mind like a key finding a lock it hadn't known it was looking for. Inside, the little girl told Helen. Her name was Lily. She was 4 years old, her mama's name was Clara, and they lived at the small house past the cottonwoods, which Helen knew meant the Ashford place, about 2 miles south. She'd been chasing a rabbit, Lily explained, with the kind of earnest detail that only a 4-year-old could deliver. And then the rabbit went into the rocks, and she followed it, and then she didn't know where the house was anymore. She said all of this very calmly. the calm of a child who had already cried everything out and was now on the other side of it. Are you hungry? A little? Can you eat a biscuit? Lily considered this with genuine seriousness. I can eat 2 biscuits, she decided. Helen set her up at the kitchen table with biscuits and honey and went to find her husband. Gideon was in the equipment shed, doing what he always did when weather was coming in. Inventorying things that didn't need inventorying, touching tools he wasn't going to use, staying busy because stillness made him anxious. He'd been that way since their son left for the service 8 years ago and came back different. Some men processed grief by talking. Gideon processed it by working, and when there was no work, he invented some. She told him about the child, about Silas. Gideon listened the way he listened to everything, without expression, without any signal of what he was thinking, letting the information land and settle before he responded. He find her on his own time or mine? Does it matter? It might. He was working the east fence, he said. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then, east fence doesn't need working until April. Helen looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said what that meant exactly. I'll go get the Ashford woman, Gideon said, moving toward the truck. You stay with the girl. Silas came into the kitchen about 20 minutes later. He'd seen to the horse, put his rain slicker on a hook by the barn door instead of bringing it inside and dripping on the floor, and washed his hands at the outdoor pump even though it must have been 40 degrees. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in both hands and looked at Lily with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite a smile, not quite relief. Something more complicated than either. There she is, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone. Lily looked up from her biscuits. You found me, she said, decisive, like she was correcting a record. I did. My rabbit ran away. Rabbits do that. It wasn't nice. Silas considered this. Probably just scared. Lily thought about that for a moment, turning it over. Were you scared? She asked him. The kitchen went quiet. Helen kept her eyes on the pot she was stirring, but she wasn't stirring it. She was listening. A little, Silas said, when I first saw you near the drop-off. I wasn't scared, Lily said. I know. You were very brave. I was looking for my rabbit. Still brave. Lily seemed satisfied with this. She went back to her biscuits. Silas poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. He didn't ask, but he also didn't take the best chair. Didn't make himself comfortable in any way that suggested he was claiming territory, and stood by the counter drinking it in 3 efficient swallows, like a man who had learned to take warmth where he found it and not expect it to last. Helen watched him, who wasn't performing. That was the thing she couldn't get out of her head. Most men, after doing what he'd done, would have been telling the story, would have been setting the scene, building toward the dangerous part, watching for reactions. Even the modest ones found ways to let you know they were being modest. Silas had given her the facts in 2 sentences and moved on to caring for his horse. She didn't know what to do with a man like that. Clara Ashford arrived 23 minutes after Gideon went to get her, which meant she must have already been in the truck before he got there. Already looking, already halfway to panic. She came through the back door without knocking and went straight to Lily with a sound that wasn't quite a word, just a mother's relief translated into noise, and held her daughter for a long time while nobody in the kitchen spoke. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red and her cheeks were wet, and she was simultaneously the most composed and most undone Helen had ever seen a person look. Who found her? Clara said. Helen nodded toward Silas. Clara stood. She was 31 or 32, Helen guessed, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept well in a long time, and a way of holding herself, shoulders slightly forward, chin slightly down, that told you she'd learned to make herself small in certain rooms. Her husband had died 14 months ago. Not a peaceful death, from what Helen had heard. A tractor accident. Fast, but not fast enough. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of Silas. Thank you, she said. Silas nodded. She's all right. Scared the rabbit more than it scared her, I think. Clara blinked, looked at Lily. Lily was already explaining about the rabbit again, mid-biscuit, not looking up. Clara made a sound that was half laugh and half something that wasn't a laugh at all. She said that? More or less. That's... Clara stopped, pressed her lips together. I'm sorry, I don't know what to say to you. I don't know how to... You don't have to say anything, Silas said, not dismissively, like he genuinely meant it. Like the debt she felt she owed was something he wasn't going to let her carry. Clara looked at him for a moment. Helen, from across the kitchen, saw it happen. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't look like anything from the outside, probably. Just two people making eye contact the way people make eye contact when they've been introduced. But it lasted a beat too long. Not in an inappropriate way. Not in a way that either of them seemed to notice, exactly. More like recognition. Like two people who had walked past each other's houses for years without knowing it and suddenly found themselves standing on the same porch step. Then Clara looked away, back at Lily, and the moment was over. But Helen had seen it. Gideon drove Clara and Lily home after supper. He'd been quieter than usual through the meal. Not unfriendly, just watchful, in the way that Gideon was watchful when he was deciding something. He'd asked Silas 2 or 3 questions about the canyon terrain, listened to the answers with his eyes slightly narrowed, said nothing afterward. Silas had answered without embellishment, just geography, just facts, just what he'd seen. After they left, Helen washed dishes and Silas dried them, which he offered to do without being asked, and they worked in the kind of companionable silence that usually takes years to develop between people. "You didn't have to be on the east fence today," Helen said. She didn't look at him when she said it. She kept her eyes on the pot she was scrubbing. A pause. Not a guilty pause. A thinking one. "No," he said. "So why were you?" Another pause. Longer. "I like the east line," he said finally. "Quiet over there." Helen handed him the pot. That was all either of them said about it. But later, after Silas had gone to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen light was off, and Gideon was in his chair half asleep over a newspaper he'd already read, Helen stood at her window for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. In 30 years of watching people come and go from this ranch, drifters, seasonal workers, men who stayed a summer and men who stayed a decade, she had developed what she privately thought of as her catalog. Not judgments, exactly. More like categories. Men who wanted to be seen doing good things. Men who did good things when people were watching and different things when they weren't. Men who were just getting through the day. And then rarely, men who did what needed doing because something in them didn't allow for not doing it. Not because of reputation, not because of reward, not even because of conscience exactly. Just constitution. The way some people can't leave a room without checking the lock. The way some people can't walk past a person who's fallen without stopping. She'd seen maybe 4 or 5 men like that in 30 years. She thought Silas Boone might be one of them. She also thought her husband was going to make the next several months very difficult for that particular man. And she thought, looking out at the dark bunkhouse window where a single lamp still burned, that Silas Boone was going to handle it the only way she suspected he knew how, quietly, stubbornly, without a word of complaint. She wasn't sure yet whether that was going to be enough. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. But she didn't sleep well. 3 days later, Gideon assigned Silas the broken section of the north fence, a 2-day job in good weather, nearly impossible in the cold snap that had moved in overnight. He mentioned it at breakfast, casually, the way you mention things you've already decided about. Silas said, "I'll start this morning." Gideon said, "Ground's probably frozen solid." Silas said, "I've got a heavier bar in the truck." That was the whole conversation. Helen poured them both more coffee and said nothing, but she filed it away. That evening, Silas came back with the fence repaired, 2 broken posts replaced, and a cut on his left hand that he'd wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from something, she didn't want to know what, and tied off himself. He ate supper, washed his dish, thanked her for the meal, and went to the bunkhouse. Gideon watched him go. Helen watched Gideon. His face was impossible to read, which meant he was reading something. She didn't say anything. Saying something would have been the wrong move, and she knew it. Gideon wasn't a man you could push toward a conclusion. He had to arrive at it himself, in his own time, by his own route, and any attempt to shorten the journey only made it longer. She trusted her husband. She just didn't always trust his instincts when grief was involved. And the shadow of his dead son-in-law was still very much in this house. She could feel it in the way Gideon talked about Clara, in the careful deliberateness with which he protected her from any direction she hadn't asked to be protected from. He'd loved that boy. Thomas Ashford had genuinely loved him, and losing him had calcified something in Gideon that used to be more flexible. He didn't want Clara hurt again. Helen understood that. What she wasn't sure Gideon understood was that protecting someone from every possible source of pain eventually becomes its own kind of prison. But that was a conversation for another time. What? The following Friday, Helen happened to be at the east window. She was always at the east window. That was simply where the light was good for reading. When she saw Silas ride past on the gray, heading toward the far fence line. It was 3:47 in the afternoon. She knew this because she checked the clock. Not because she was suspicious, just because she'd started paying attention. At 4:15, she saw Clara Ashford hanging laundry on her line 2 miles south, a small figure against the brown winter grass. At 4:20, the two small figures that were Silas and Clara stood at the fence line that divided the Whitmore East pasture from the Ashford property, close enough to talk, but not close enough to touch, while the gray stood patient and the laundry moved in the wind. At 4:35, Silas turned and rode back toward the barn. Helen closed her book without marking her page. 11 days, she thought. In 11 days, this man had told her almost nothing about himself, where he was from, why he'd left there, what he was looking for or running from, or simply moving toward the way some men moved. Not toward anything specific, just away from staying. But in 11 days, she'd seen him replace broken fence posts and frozen ground without being asked twice. Seen him carry a frightened child across 6 miles of canyon terrain in a building storm. Seen him deflect thanks with the ease of someone who genuinely didn't understand what the fuss was about. And now she'd seen him ride to the east fence every Friday afternoon at the exact hour Clara Ashford hung her laundry. She didn't know if he knew she watched. She suspected it didn't matter to him either way. Some men showed you who they were in the big moments, the crises, the dramatic turns. Silas Boone showed you who he was in the Fridays. And Helen Whitmore, who had been watching people from kitchen windows for 30 years, thought that might be the most important thing she'd learned about a person in a very long time. She went to start supper. From the hall, she could hear Gideon in his office, moving papers around his desk, doing nothing in particular. She thought, he has no idea what's building in this valley. She thought, that's going to change. She stirred the pot and waited, with the patience of a woman who'd learned that the most important things never arrived on your schedule. They arrived on theirs. And they always arrived. The apple showed up on a Thursday. Clara didn't notice it at first. She was carrying Lily in from the truck. The girl had fallen asleep on the way back from town, boneless and heavy the way sleeping children get. And Clara had one arm under her knees and the other under her shoulders, and her keys still in her mouth when she came around the side of the house and nearly stepped on it. She stopped, set the keys in her coat pocket with the hand that wasn't holding Lily's knees, looked at the apple for a moment. It was sitting on the second porch step, not the top one, which seemed like an oddly considered placement, low enough that it wouldn't roll off, high enough that it wasn't on the ground. It was a good apple, not a store apple, a real one, slightly uneven, the kind that came off an old tree that nobody had bothered to prune properly in years. Red on one side, still a little green on the other. There was no note. Clara stood there in the November cold with her sleeping daughter in her arms and looked at that apple for probably 30 seconds, which was 25 seconds longer than the situation technically required. And then she carried Lily inside and put her to bed and came back out and picked it up. She turned it over in her hands. She had no proof of anything. There were 3 other ranches within reasonable distance of her property. Any of a dozen people could have left something on her step. Marin Howell, from the north pasture, sometimes brought vegetables when her garden came in heavy, and Ray Dubois down the road had stopped by twice since Thomas died with firewood she hadn't asked for. People in this valley looked after each other. That was just how things worked. But Marin's garden was finished for the season and Ray always knocked. Clara went inside. She put the apple on the counter and stared at it while the coffee percolated and the wind moved around the corners of the house, and Lily slept in the back room making the small, even sounds she always made when she was deep under. Then she cut the apple into slices and ate them standing at the counter. They were very good. She didn't let herself think too much about that. Silas, for his part, was not thinking about the apple at all. I was thinking about the north fence again, specifically the section that ran along the creek bed, which Gideon had pointed out at breakfast needed checking before the next freeze made the posts heave. It was a real job, unlike some of the things he'd been assigned lately, which had a quality to them that he recognized but wasn't going to name out loud. He'd been given hard work before, work that was designed to find a man's limit. That was fine. He didn't particularly mind being tested. What he minded was pretending he didn't know it was happening, but Gideon wasn't a man who wanted his methods acknowledged, and Silas was smart enough to understand that. He pulled posts for 4 hours in cold that made his fingers clumsy, and replaced 3 of them before the light started going. His left hand, still tender from the cut 2 weeks back, ached in the cold the way hands did when they hadn't fully healed but had been forced back to work anyway. He'd wrapped it this morning. By noon, the wrapping was useless. He took it off and worked without it. When he rode back in, Helen was at the window. She was always at the window. He'd noticed it the first week, the way she moved there naturally, without appearing to be watching for anything in particular, just present in that spot the way furniture becomes part of a room. But her eyes were always moving. She registered everything that came across that yard. He'd seen her clock the state of a horse's gait from 40 yards and say nothing until the evening, then mention it so casually at supper that Gideon thought he'd noticed it himself. She was the sharpest person on the ranch, possibly the sharpest person he'd met in a long time, and he'd met a reasonable number of people in a lot of different places. He wasn't sure she knew he'd figured that out. He thought she might, though. He unsaddled the gray and gave her an extra measure of grain, because she'd worked hard, and she didn't complain about it, which he considered a virtue worth rewarding. Then he checked the healed cut on the horse's left foreleg, an old wire injury from before he'd arrived, poorly dressed by whoever had handled it first, and cleaned it again and packed it fresh and put the gray in her stall and leaned against the stall door for a minute in the dark of the barn. Just a minute. He allowed himself that. A minute to be tired without managing it. His back hurt. His hand hurt. He was 36 years old, and he'd spent the last 14 of those years doing work that wore a man out in ways that didn't always show on the outside. And some days the accumulated weight of all of it sat on him harder than others. He wasn't complaining. He'd chosen this. He kept choosing it, every morning, which was the thing about choices. They weren't one-time events. They were habits. You chose who you were going to be every day until eventually you stopped having to think about it. I thought about Lily. He thought about the way she'd said you found me. Decisive, corrective, like she was setting the historical record straight for someone who'd gotten it wrong. He didn't know why that had stayed with him. Kids said things. Most of them didn't stick. But that one had. He pushed off the stall door and went to wash up for supper. The second gift arrived 2 weeks after the first. This time it was left at the fence line. The fence line specifically where the east pasture met the Ashford property. Not on the post, not hanging from the wire, but set in the grass on Clara's side, just inside the boundary. A small basket. 4 jars of preserves, handmade, labeled in handwriting that Clara had to study for a moment before she understood it was someone trying to write neatly who didn't usually write neatly. Strawberry, apple butter, blackberry, plum. She picked up the blackberry jar and looked at the label. The letters were slightly uneven. The B in blackberry was written twice. She could see where the first attempt had been crossed out and started again. It was such a small and human detail that it did something unexpected to the place behind her sternum. A small shift, like something that had been held very still for a long time moving a fraction of an inch. She stood at the fence line in the December cold and held the jar and looked at the Whitmore East pasture, which was empty. Of course it was empty. It was 3 in the afternoon and there was work to do on any ranch, and whoever had left this had left it and gone back to doing it, not waiting around to be seen or thanked or asked about. She knew who it was. She hadn't let herself know it before, with the apple. But standing at the fence line holding a jar of blackberry preserves. Labeled in someone else's careful, imperfect handwriting, she let herself know it. She carried the basket inside. She set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. Then she got out her mixing bowl and started on a pie, which she hadn't made in 14 months because Thomas had been the one who loved pie, and making it after he was gone had felt like setting a place at a table for someone who wasn't there. But she made one now. Apple, because she had the apples. She'd been saving them, she realized, though she hadn't consciously framed it that way. And because baking kept her hands busy, and her hands needed to be busy right now, or she was going to do something foolish, like stand at her kitchen window looking east across the pasture and letting herself feel things she wasn't sure she was ready to feel. The pie was not perfect. The crust was a little thick on one side. She hadn't crimped the edges properly, or maybe she had crimped them too hard, and one section had separated slightly in the oven. It looked homemade in the slightly embarrassing way that things looked when you'd been out of practice for over a year. She wrapped it carefully anyway. She left it at the fence line the next morning before she could talk herself out of it. Gideon found out about it on a Wednesday. Not from Helen. Helen wasn't going to tell him. But the Whitmore Ranch was not a large operation, and Ray Dubois, who delivered feed twice a month and had the conversational economy of a man who'd been alone too long, mentioned to Gideon in passing that he'd seen the Ashford woman at the east fence line the last couple of Fridays. Twice. Maybe 3 times. Just standing there, Gideon said. Talking, Ray said. To your new hand. Ray drove away without reading Gideon's expression, which was fortunate, because Gideon's expression in that moment was not something he would have wanted interpreted by someone who liked to talk. He didn't say anything at supper. He didn't say anything the next morning or the morning after that. He waited 4 days. The patience of a man who had learned that rushing to a reaction was how you made it the wrong reaction. And then on the following Sunday, he pulled Silas aside after the morning chores and stood with him near the equipment shed and said, in the neutral tone of a man discussing something he had not yet decided to be angry about, I hear you've been spending time at the east fence. Silas looked at him. I check it Fridays. You asked me to keep up with it. I mentioned it once in October. Yes, sir. Gideon was quiet for a moment, a long moment, the kind that was designed to make a person feel it. Silas didn't feel it. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at Gideon with the same level, unbothered expression he brought to everything, and waited. Clara Ashford is my daughter, Gideon said. You know that. I know that. She's been through a hard time. I expect she has. She's not looking for... Gideon stopped, reframed. She's got a child to raise and a property to manage, and she doesn't have the bandwidth for complications. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I agree with that. Gideon blinked. He'd expected the conversation to go differently. He'd expected some version of defense or denial or a young man's bluster about his intentions being honorable. He hadn't expected flat agreement. Then what are you doing at the east fence every Friday? Gideon said. Checking it, Silas said, and sometimes talking to Clara. About what? The smallest pause. About nothing much. Weather. How the ground's doing. Lily had a cold last week. She mentioned it. Did she? She's doing better. The cold. Gideon looked at him for a long time. Silas looked back. The equipment shed was cold and smelled of diesel and old metal, and the wind was finding the gaps in the siding, which it always did, and somewhere the loose bracket on the water trough was banging in that irregular way that had been annoying Gideon for 3 weeks, and he still hadn't fixed it. I'm going to need you on the south pasture starting Monday, Gideon said finally. Full time. We've got fence issues down there I've been putting off. I can handle the south pasture and still check the east line. I didn't ask if you could. A beat. No, sir, Silas said. I'll start on the south pasture Monday. He went back to work. Gideon stood by the equipment shed for a while longer than he'd intended to. Helen heard about this conversation from Gideon that evening, which meant he'd wanted her to hear about it. He framed it as a simple reassignment of duties, but she knew her husband well enough to hear the architecture underneath the words, the deliberateness of it, the way he described Silas's response with a slight tightening around his eyes that meant he hadn't gotten what he'd expected and wasn't sure yet what to do about that. He agreed with you, Helen said. He did. That doesn't seem like a man who's trying to cause trouble. That seems like a man who knows how to play a longer game, Gideon said. Helen considered that. It wasn't wrong, exactly. But it also wasn't right. There was a difference between patience and strategy, and she didn't think what she'd observed in Silas over the past 6 weeks was strategy. Strategy required a desired outcome you were working toward. What she saw in Silas felt more like nature, like the way water moved. It didn't have an agenda. It just went where it could go and stopped when it couldn't, without drama, without complaint. But she didn't say that to Gideon. Not yet. What did you tell him to do? She asked. South pasture, starting Monday. The south pasture fence is fine. It will need attention before spring. Helen picked up her book. Gideon looked at her. She didn't look up from the page. You have something to say, he said. I have lots of things to say. I'm deciding which ones are worth it. Gideon made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. He picked up his paper and shook it out and started reading, and the room settled back into its evening quiet, and Helen turned a page she hadn't actually read and thought about Clara Ashford making a pie with imperfect crust and leaving it at a fence line. She thought about what that cost, for a woman who'd been through what Clara had been through. She thought it probably cost more than anyone realized. December hardened into something serious. The temperatures dropped in a way that stopped being interesting and became simply punishing. The kind of cold that made everything take longer. Starting engines, carrying water, doing any task that required bare hands. The ranch contracted the way it always did in deep winter, everyone's world shrinking to the distance between the house and the barn and back again, and small tensions became larger ones simply through proximity. Silas worked the south pasture. He did it well. He did everything well, which was both a virtue and, for Gideon, an increasingly uncomfortable data point. You couldn't find a reason to dismiss a man who never gave you one. And Silas Boone, whatever else he was, did not give reasons for dismissal. He was first up in the mornings. He was careful with the equipment. He got along with the other two hands, Pete Garraway, who'd been on the Whitmore place for 6 years and had strong opinions about everything, and a younger man named Dev who'd started in September and was still figuring out his place in the hierarchy, in a way that was neither aggressive nor ingratiating. He simply worked beside them, said what needed saying, left the rest alone. Pete noticed things. He'd been on the ranch long enough to have an opinion about everyone on it, and he shared his opinions with Helen over coffee on the mornings Gideon was in town, which was Tuesdays. He doesn't talk about himself, Pete said one Tuesday, not for the first time. You've mentioned that, Helen said. It bothers me. Why? Pete considered. He was 60, had a face like a used topographical map, and chose his words with the care of a man who'd said too many wrong ones in his youth. Because men who don't talk about themselves are usually either hiding something or they just don't care what you think about them. First kind, you want to watch. Second kind, you want to keep. Helen handed him more coffee. Which do you think he is? She asked. Pete looked out the window toward the barn. That's what's bothering me, he said. I keep thinking one and finding evidence of the other. Helen said nothing. Pete drank his coffee. Clara came by the ranch on the 17th of December. She didn't call ahead. She arrived mid-morning on a Tuesday, Helen noted when Gideon was in town, with Lily in tow and a covered dish in her hands that turned out to be a beef stew she'd made with the last of her garden carrots, and a bottle of her father's favorite kind of hot sauce that she'd driven 40 minutes to get from the only store that carried it. I wanted to thank you, Clara said, standing in the kitchen, for putting up with us, with me coming around and Lily being... Lily is never a burden, Helen said. I know you're... Clara stopped, set the dish on the counter, started over. I know Daddy can be a lot. About me. About... things. Helen looked at her daughter-in-law with a steadiness she hoped was the right kind. Your father loves you. I know he does. Clara's voice was careful. The voice of someone who had thought about this conversation beforehand, planned it out, and was now finding that the plan didn't quite fit the reality of being in the room. I want you to know that I'm not doing anything that would cause problems. I know Daddy worries, and I know Silas works here, and I don't want to... Clara stopped. Helen sat down at the table and waited. Clara sat down across from her, and Lily, who had gone directly to the corner where Helen kept a basket of old pots and wooden spoons that served as toys when small people needed occupying, began a loud and productive conversation with herself about cooking. What do you want? Helen said. Not unkindly, just directly. Clara looked at her. Her eyes were steady, but there was something behind them. Not panic, exactly. More like the look of someone who has been standing at a door for a long time and has finally put their hand on the knob but hasn't turned it yet. I don't know, she said. That's honest. It doesn't feel honest. It feels like a cop-out. The honest answer to what do you want is almost always I don't know until you're brave enough to know it. That's not a cop-out. That's just where you are. Clara looked at the table. At her hands on the table, she had working hands, calloused along the palm, her nails cut short and practical. The hands of a woman who ran a small property alone. He makes me feel like a person again, Clara said quietly. Helen didn't say anything. Silas. When we talk at the fence, he doesn't look at me like I'm broken. He doesn't treat me like I'm made of glass. He just talks to me about regular things, normal things, like I'm just a person having a conversation. She stopped. I know that sounds like nothing. It doesn't sound like nothing, Helen said. It probably sounds ridiculous that something so small... Clara. Helen put her hand over Clara's on the table. Briefly. Not dramatically. the way you steadied something that was starting to tip. People who've been through what you've been through don't always need the grand gesture. Sometimes the thing that reaches them is just someone who treats them like they're still here. Clara's jaw tightened, the way jaws did when tears were being held back by sheer determination. Lily banged 2 pots together and announced that the soup was ready. Clara laughed, a real laugh, sudden and helpless. And Helen laughed with her, and the moment that had been building dissolved into the ordinary warmth of a kitchen with a 4-year-old who was very serious about her cooking. Oh, Silas didn't see Clara again until Christmas Eve. It wasn't planned. He'd been in town for supplies. Gideon sent him alone, which was either trust or something that looked like it from a certain angle, and he was loading the last of the bags into the truck bed when he heard his name. He turned around. Clara was standing on the sidewalk outside the hardware store with Lily on her hip and 4 packages under her other arm and an expression on her face that said she'd been managing more than she could hold for longer than she wanted to admit. "Let me," Silas said. He took the packages before she could argue. She didn't argue anyway, just shifted Lily to her other hip and looked at him with those level dark eyes. "You don't have to," she said. "I know." He'd put the packages in her truck, which was parked 2 spots down, and came back and stood on the sidewalk in the December cold, and Lily looked at him from Clara's hip with the assessing seriousness of a 4-year-old and said, "Do you have a Christmas tree?" "No," he said. Lily frowned. "Why not?" "Don't have any place to put one." Lily thought about this. "You could put it in the barn." "That would be a fire hazard." Lily looked at her mother. "What's a fire hazard?" "It means not a good idea," Clara said. She was trying not to smile. Silas could see it, the way the corner of her mouth was doing something she was working to manage. He looked away before she caught him noticing. "If you need anything," he said, to no one in particular, to the air between them. "This time of year can be a lot." He wasn't sure why he'd said it. It came out before the version of him that edited things could stop it. Clara was quiet for a moment. The sidewalk was cold. Someone down the street was playing a radio too loud from inside a warm building, something with a fiddle in it that the wind kept breaking up and rearranging. "It is a lot," she said, quietly. "Just the fact of it, no decoration." "First Christmas after." He stopped. Didn't finish. He had no right to finish that sentence. He hadn't earned the right to say the dead man's name to this woman. "Yes," she said, "just that. The one word." He nodded. Lily said, "We're going to have pie." "Pie's good," Silas said. "It is," Clara said. She was looking at him in the particular way she had sometimes at the fence line, like she was trying to solve something, like she was working out a problem that didn't have a clean solution and wasn't sure if that was a failure of the problem or a failure of her method. "Do you have somewhere to be? For dinner?" He opened his mouth. "Never mind," she said before he could answer. Never mind, I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. I shouldn't have." "Clara." He said her name the same way he said most things, quiet, level, without urgency. "Don't apologize for being kind." She looked at him. He looked back. Lily started telling a detailed story about a dog she had seen outside the grocery store and how it had a hat on, which both of them turned to listen to, and when Lily reached the part about the hat apparently being green, Clara said she should get going, or the pie would be late, and Silas said he should get back with the supplies, and they separated on the sidewalk with the ordinary small awkwardness of 2 people who have been closer to saying something than they intended. He drove back to the ranch. He put the supplies away. He ate supper with Pete and Dev and didn't talk much, which wasn't unusual. Later, in the bunkhouse, he lay on his back on the narrow cot and looked at the ceiling and thought about nothing in particular, which was something he'd gotten good at over the years. The ability to think about nothing was useful. It kept certain things from accumulating. It kept the weight manageable. He was good at it. He lay there thinking about nothing for a long time. The nothing had, he noticed, a specific face and a specific voice, and a very specific way of looking at a problem that didn't have a clean solution. He eventually went to sleep. January brought the cold down hard and personal, the kind of cold that stopped being weather and started being a character in your story, something with presence, with intent, that you had to account for in every decision you made from the moment you got up to the moment you lay down. Pipes froze. Engines refused. The water trough cracked along the old repair line that Pete had said would hold until spring, which it did not. Gideon worked Silas and the others hard through it, which was fair. There was a lot of work. and the particular quality of his fairness had shifted slightly, which Silas noticed. The assignments were no longer designed, they were just assignments. Hard ones because January was hard, but not shaped by anything beyond the practical need to keep a working ranch functioning in brutal conditions. Silas didn't remark on this. He just worked. The third week of January, a calf got into the wire near the flooded section of the creek. It happened late in the afternoon, in the narrow window between the day's last light and full dark, and it happened during the worst 2 hours of wind they'd had all month. Pete found it on his way back from the equipment shed and came to get Silas, because Silas was closer, and Pete's knees had been giving him trouble since November. Silas went without being asked twice. He took wire cutters, a blanket, a length of rope, and went alone because by the time anyone else geared up, the calf would have been in that wire another half hour, and that was time it didn't have. The creek had flooded the low section, and the mud around it was unstable in a way that wasn't immediately obvious until you were in it, and Silas was in it before he knew how far it went. He went into the knee on the first step, caught himself, worked free, went in at the hip on the second step trying a different approach, lost his footing entirely for a moment before the rope he'd anchored to a post brought him up short. The calf was terrified and fighting, which made everything harder. Cutting the wire while an animal was panicking and pulling against it was how you got cut badly, and he got cut badly. The wire opened a 6-inch line along his right forearm before he got the tension released, and he felt it happen and noted it the way you noted these things when there was still a job to finish, which was later. He got the calf free, wrapped it in the blanket, carried it back across the flooded section and up the bank, which took 4 tries because his arm was bleeding down into his glove, and the calf weighed more than it looked, and the mud was not cooperating. He made it to the barn. He put the calf down in the clean straw, and Pete was there with a lantern, and when Pete held the lantern up and got a proper look at Silas, he said considerably, "That needs stitching." "Probably," Silas said. "Helen will after the calf." Pete looked at the calf, looked at Silas. "Calf's walking. You're bleeding on my clean straw. I'll be quick." He was quick. He checked the calf's legs, its breathing, its eyes, dressed the wire cut on its right shoulder the best he could, got it settled and eating from the bucket Pete held out, washed his own arm under the cold pump, which was, in the moment, an experience, and wrapped it in the cloth Pete handed him and went to the house. Helen took one look at him. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She cleaned the wound without ceremony. She'd done this before, clearly, many times, and her hands were steady and efficient, and when she pulled the edges together to put the first butterfly closure on, she said, without looking up, "You did the calf first. The calf was hurt worse. You don't know that. You can't see your own arm." "I could see the calf." Helen applied the second closure, and the third. She had small, precise hands, nothing wasted in the movement, like someone who had learned that efficiency and care weren't opposites. Silas watched her work and said nothing. "Gideon was going to go out there," she said, "when Pete came in. I told him Pete already sent someone." "Pete did." "I told him it was Dev." Silas looked at her. She kept her eyes on his arm, applied a fourth closure. "Why?" he said. "Because if I told him it was you, he would have come out and gotten in the way, and you would have had to manage him and the calf, and the wire, and the mud, and the dark, all at the same time, and that seemed like a lot." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do that." "I'm aware." She pressed a piece of gauze over the whole thing and taped it down firmly. "I do a lot of things I don't have to do. It's a habit." She put her medical supplies away with the same efficiency she'd used applying them. "He's going to keep testing you," she said, her back to him, arranging things in the cabinet. Silas didn't answer. "Not because he thinks you're a bad man," Helen said. She turned around. "Because he's afraid you're a good one." Silas looked at her. She looked back at him with those steady, take-no-prisoners eyes that had seen everything that moved across this yard for 30 years. "He lost Thomas," she said. "Clara lost Thomas. And Thomas he was a good man. A genuinely good man. And it didn't matter. Good men can still leave. Good men can still go out on a tractor on an ordinary Tuesday and not come back." She paused. "Gideon doesn't know what to do with the fact that goodness isn't protection." Silas said nothing for a long moment. "I'm not trying to be Thomas," he said finally. "I know that. I'm not trying to be anything." "I know that too." Helen untied her apron and folded it over the chair. "That's the part he hasn't figured out yet. Go get some sleep. That arm needs rest more than it needs anything else." He stood, pulled on his coat carefully over the bandaged arm. "Helen," he said at the door. She looked at him. "Thank you." She made a sound that was not quite dismissive and not quite warm and was somehow both at once. "Go to bed, Silas." He went. The kitchen light went off. Outside, the January cold pressed against every window of the ranch, like it was checking for the weakest one. It didn't find any. The arm healed slower than Silas would have liked. I didn't complain about it. He wrapped it every morning, changed the dressing every evening, and worked around it the way you worked around any obstacle. Not by pretending it wasn't there, but by adjusting the mechanics of everything he did until the limitation became incorporated into the routine. Pete noticed and said nothing, which was Pete's way of being considerate. Dev noticed and asked about it once, got a short answer, and didn't ask again, which was Dev learning something about how certain men preferred to handle their own business. Gideon noticed too. He didn't mention it directly, but 2 days after the calf incident, 2 days after Helen had patched Silas up at the kitchen table, Gideon came by the barn while Silas was working a young horse that had been giving everyone trouble since October, a 3-year-old bay gelding with a habit of throwing his shoulder into whatever was on his left side, and an opinion about the saddle pad that he expressed loudly and physically on a rotating basis. Gideon stood at the fence and watched for a while without saying anything. Silas knew he was there. He didn't acknowledge it. He kept working the horse through the small circles he'd been using all week to build softness in the gelding's left shoulder, applying light pressure, releasing it the moment the horse gave even a fraction of what he was asking for. It was slow work. It required a kind of patience that most people didn't have, because most people wanted results they could measure, and this kind of work didn't give you results you could measure, not on any given day. You just kept showing up and doing the right thing in the right order, and eventually the horse either came to trust you or he didn't. Gideon watched for 15 minutes. Then he said, "He's been that way since we got him. My last hand couldn't do anything with him." "He's not mean," Silas said. "He didn't stop working. He's scared." "Of what?" "Something on his left side. Old memory. I don't know what." "Can you fix it?" Silas thought about that for a moment. He asked the horse to move left, felt the familiar resistance, the slight stiffening of the gelding's whole body, the bracing, and softened his own body in response, waiting. The horse took one step left. Silas released everything. "I can give him something better to remember," he said. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hands in his coat pockets and walked back toward the house. Silas stood in the cold pen with the bay gelding and thought about nothing in particular. February arrived without apology. The valley had been through bad Februaries before. Everyone who lived there long enough had their own catalog of brutal ones. But this one had a specific relentlessness to it that wore on people in different ways. The snow was persistent rather than dramatic, the kind that accumulated slowly and didn't stop, filling in tracks and fence lines and the places between things until everything looked the same flat white. Roads got uncertain. The drive to town became an event that required planning. The world contracted further. Clara managed. She managed the way she managed everything since Thomas died. By making a list, working through it, not stopping, not letting herself get ahead of herself to the part where she thought about how long this was going to last, because that part was too large to look at directly. She kept the furnace running. She kept Lily fed and warm and busy with the specific chaos of a 4-year-old who had opinions about everything, including but not limited to the color of her socks, the correct amount of butter on toast, and whether or not the cat that sometimes appeared at the back door deserved to come inside. The cat did not come inside. Clara held that line firmly. Lily was working to erode it. On a Thursday morning in the second week of February, with the snow coming down in the steady, unhurried way it had been coming down for 3 days, Clara was chopping wood in the side yard when the splitting maul glanced off a knot in a particularly stubborn piece of elm and came back and caught her across the shin. She said a word she was glad Lily wasn't outside to hear. She sat down in the snow beside the woodpile and held her leg and breathed through her nose for a while. It wasn't broken. She knew what broken felt like, had broken her wrist falling from a horse at 16. But it was a substantial impact, and the pain was real and insistent, and she sat with it for a full 2 minutes before she made herself get up. She got up. She looked at the remaining wood. She split it. It took her another 40 minutes, working slower, redistributing her weight, accommodating the leg. The last few pieces were less precise than the first ones, She stacked them against the house anyway, and went inside and put snow on her shin and drank coffee standing at the counter and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was tired. Not physically, or not only physically. She was tired of managing every single thing by herself, in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with simple mathematics. There was one of her, and a lot of everything else, and some days the ratio felt fine, and some days it felt like trying to hold a river back with your hands. She knew Thomas wasn't coming back. She had known that for 14 months. She had done the work of knowing it, the terrible work of revising the future in your mind, of learning to look at a shared bed and a shared set of coffee cups and a shared Tuesday and understand that they were now only yours. That work was not finished. She wasn't sure it was ever finished, exactly, but she had gotten somewhere. She was somewhere that was not paralysis, not grief's first country, not the place where she couldn't imagine any future at all. She was somewhere she was starting, cautiously, like a person who has been in a dark room for a long time and is trying their eyes against the light to imagine a different kind of future. And that was terrifying in a way she hadn't expected, because the first grief was like falling. You had no control over it, and no choices within it, only the falling. But this new thing, this tentative considering of a future that looked different from the one she'd planned, this required choices, active ones, and choices meant you could make the wrong one. She put her cup in the sink and went to get Lily up from her nap. Lily woke up sideways, which was how she usually woke up, diagonal across the bed, one arm off the side, her hair suggesting a significant amount of activity during sleep. She looked at Clara with the trusting directness of a child who had not yet learned to filter her first thoughts. "Is Silas coming today?" she asked. Clara blinked. "No," she said. "Why not?" "Because he works at Grandpa's ranch." Lily considered this. "But he could come." "Lily, he fixes things," Lily said, with the practical specificity of someone presenting evidence. "The gate was broken. He fixed it." This was true. 3 weeks ago, in a cold snap between snows, Silas had come by the Ashford property on his way back from town. He'd mentioned he was making a run for supplies and asked, at the fence line, if she needed anything, and she'd said the gate post was loose, more by accident than intention, and he'd stopped and fixed it, which had taken 20 minutes and required 2 tools from his truck, and produced in Clara a complicated wash of feeling that she had not fully sorted out yet. "I was passing by," Clara said. "That was a coincidence." Lily looked at her with the expression she wore when she had decided something was not quite accurate, but had decided to let it go for now. Clara got her daughter dressed and made her lunch and did not think about Silas Boone. She mostly succeeded. The incident with Gideon happened on a Saturday. Not a dramatic incident, not a confrontation. It was worse than a confrontation, in some ways, because a confrontation would have been clean. What happened instead was a conversation that started in one place and arrived somewhere neither of them had intended to go. Clara had driven over to help Helen with some mending. Helen's eyes had been giving her trouble in low light, something she mentioned to no one except Clara, who had noticed it herself and brought it up gently and been met with the particular stubbornness of a woman who did not enjoy acknowledging limitations. They were in the sitting room with the mending basket between them when Gideon came in from the barn, still in his outdoor coat, and stopped when he saw Clara. He looked tired. Not the regular tiredness of ranch work, but something underneath it, something that had been accumulating. "Stay for supper," he said. It was not quite an invitation and not quite a command, just the assumption of her presence, the way he'd always done it, as though she was still 16 and there was no question of where she'd eat. "I can't. Lily's at Marin's and I told her 3 o'clock. Marin can keep her another hour." "Daddy, I want to talk to you." Helen looked up from the shirt she was mending. Her expression was the expression of someone who had seen this coming and was deciding whether to intervene or let it run. Clara put down her mending. "Okay." Gideon sat in his chair. He took his time about it, took off his coat, hung it on the back of the chair, sat down with the deliberateness of a man organizing his thoughts through his movements. "Marin told me something," he said. Clara waited. "She said she saw you and Silas in town at Christmas." He said it flatly, not accusingly, just the fact, laid down. "We ran into each other. He helped me carry packages to my truck." "She said you talked for a while." "We talked for a few minutes. On the sidewalk, in the cold." "Yes," Clara said carefully. "On the sidewalk, in the cold. For a few minutes." Gideon looked at her. His hands were folded on the arms of the chair, his shoulders level, and there was something in his face that Clara recognized from her childhood. The controlled expression he wore when what he was feeling and what he was deciding to say were not the same thing. "He fixed your gate," Gideon said. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. Not guilt. She hadn't done anything wrong and she knew it. Something more like anticipatory exhaustion. The knowledge of how long this road was and how tired she already was of walking it. The post was loose. He offered. He offered. Yes. And you let him. He fixed a gatepost, Daddy. It wasn't a... She stopped. Chose a different word. It was a gatepost. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Helen had set down her mending without appearing to set it down. Her hands were still in her lap, holding the shirt, but she wasn't mending. "He doesn't have roots," Gideon said. "You understand that. I have men come through here every season who know how to work hard and be decent, and then one day something calls them down the road and they're gone. There's no malice in it. That's just what drifters do." "He's been here since October," Claire said. "That's 4 months. That's longer than the last 3 men you hired put together." Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. "That's not the point." "Then what's the point?" "The point is that Thomas..." He stopped, started again. "The point is that you and Lily..." "Daddy." Clara's voice came out quieter than she'd intended. Not angry, almost gentle. "Thomas is gone. You know that. I know that. I think about it every single day. I don't need you to remind me. But Thomas being gone doesn't mean that I..." She pressed her lips together for a moment. "It doesn't mean I have to stay stopped." The room was very quiet. Gideon looked at his daughter for a long time. Helen looked at her husband for a long time. Nobody said anything for a moment that seemed to last considerably longer than a moment. "I'm not asking you to stay stopped," Gideon said. His voice had shifted, just slightly. The controlled quality was still there, but something underneath it had moved. "I'm asking you to be careful." "I am being careful. He talked to you for 5 minutes at the fence on Christmas Eve and you let him fix your gate. And you had him repair fence in frozen ground and pull a calf out of wire in a flood," Clara said, not loudly, not with heat, but clearly. "In January. Alone. At night." She paused. "What was that about, Daddy?" Gideon looked away. "I know what you've been doing," Clara said. I'm not angry about it. I understand why. But if you've spent 4 months trying to find a reason to send him away and you haven't found one, maybe that means something." Gideon said nothing. Helen picked up her mending again. Clara stood up. "I have to get Lily." She got her coat from the hook by the door, pulled it on, buttoned it, found her keys. At the door she stopped. "He looked at me in town," she said, "on Christmas Eve, like I was a person, not a widow, not your daughter, not someone who needed to be handled." She didn't turn around. "I don't know what to do with that yet, but I know it mattered." She went out. The door closed. Gideon sat in his chair and looked at the floor. After a long time, Helen said, "She's right." "I know she is," Gideon said. Then, "I know she is," he said again quietly, "and I'm still afraid." Helen looked at her husband. This man she had been married to for 34 years, who had never once in those 34 years admitted fear without it costing him something significant. And she reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand on his arm and left it there. She didn't say anything else. Sometimes that was the right thing. March came in uncertain, the way March always did, switching back and forth between almost spring and the cold's last argument, never fully committing to either. The snow softened and went gray and the mud started, the deep mud of thaw that grabbed at your boots and made every step a negotiation. Silas had been thinking about leaving, not seriously, or not in the way that required action. More like a habit of thought, a reflex, something. He returned to automatically, the way you return to checking a pocket where you used to keep something important. He'd been leaving places his whole adult life, had gotten very good at it, had developed a kind of efficiency around it. The ability to read the moment when staying became more complicated than going and move before that moment arrived. He had a talent for timing it so that the leaving was always his choice. He sat with the thought on a Tuesday evening in the bunkhouse, while Pete was already asleep and Dev was reading something with a cover he kept angled away. And he examined the thought the way you examined something you'd found, turning it over, checking its weight, its edges. I wasn't going to leave. He'd known that for a while. He just hadn't let himself know it officially until now. I wasn't going to leave because there was a 4-year-old who had told him he'd found her, which was the most precise thing anyone had said to him in a long time. He wasn't going to leave because there was a woman at a fence line who looked at him like he was a problem worth solving. I wasn't going to leave because Helen Whitmore had covered for him with a husband who hadn't yet decided what he was, and because Pete had stood in a flooded creek bed with a lantern and waited, and because even Dev, who barely knew him, had taken to leaving the last cup of coffee in the pot rather than finishing it, which was a small thing that turned out to mean something. I wasn't going to leave because he was tired of leaving. That was the truest part of it. He was 36 years old, and he was tired in the specific way of someone who has moved too much and built nothing and woken up too many mornings in places that didn't know his name. He lay down on the narrow cot and looked at the ceiling. He wasn't going to leave. That decision, once it settled, had a weight to it that was not unpleasant. The conversation with Gideon happened on a cold Tuesday morning in the middle of March, when the last big freeze of the season came back through with the particular spite of something that knows it's losing. Silas was in the equipment shed doing maintenance on the tractor when Gideon came in and stood for a moment and looked at what he was doing without commenting on it. The tractor had a fuel line issue that Pete had been working around for 2 months by nursing it through careful use. But careful use was a temporary solution, and Silas had ordered the part and installed it the day before without being asked. Gideon looked at the tractor. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Pete mentioned it in November, figured it needed doing before spring planting. You ordered the part yourself. Charged it to the ranch account. It's in the ledger." Gideon moved further into the shed, which was warm from the space heater Silas had going, and stood with his hands in his coat pockets. "You're planning to stay," Gideon said. It was not a question. Silas looked up from what he was doing. He had a wrench in his right hand and his good arm was resting on the tractor housing, and he looked at Gideon directly. "Yes, sir." "Why?" Silas thought about several answers. He chose the true one. "Because it's a good ranch," he said, "and the people are worth staying for." Gideon was quiet for a long time. The heater made its small sound. Outside, the wind was finding the gaps in the equipment shed the way it found every gap in every structure in this valley, eventually. Persistent. Patient. "My son-in-law was a good man," Gideon said. "I know." "You didn't know him." "I know what Clara carries. That tells me something." Gideon looked at him. "What does it tell you?" Silas set down the wrench. He took his time with the answer, not because he was stalling, but because this was the kind of thing you should get right. "It tells me she loves someone who was worth loving," he said. "That doesn't make it easier, it makes it harder. Because she knows what it is to have something real, and she knows what it is to lose it. A woman like that doesn't trust easily. She shouldn't trust easily." He paused. "And she hasn't." Gideon looked at him for a long time. "What do you want?" Gideon said. Plain and flat. The same question Helen had asked Clara in the kitchen 2 months ago, though neither man knew that. "The same thing you want for her," Silas said. "For Lily to grow up safe, for Clara to have a life that's worth something, for the people around me to be better off for having me around." He picked the wrench back up. "I know I'm not Thomas. I'm not trying to be. I'm just trying to be someone worth keeping." The shed was quiet. Gideon turned and walked toward the door. At the door he stopped, his back still to Silas. "The north pasture gate is rusting out," he said. "Needs replacing before spring." "I'll get to it this week." Gideon walked out. Silas watched the door for a moment. Then he went back to work on the tractor. But Clara came to the fence line on a Friday in late March. She came without Lily, which was unusual. Lily was at Marin's, she explained, and she had errands, but she'd come by this way first, which was not the most direct route to anything, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. The snow was almost completely gone. The ground was soft and dark, and the cottonwoods at the south end of the east pasture were doing the first uncertain thing of spring, a faint color change that wasn't quite green yet, but wasn't winter anymore either. The air had that particular quality it got at the edge of seasons, the smell of cold and new earth at the same time, something unresolved about it, something still deciding. Clara stood at the fence and looked out at the pasture for a moment before she spoke. "My father talked to me," she said. "About what?" "About you." She turned to look at him. She was wearing a dark coat, her hair loose today rather than pinned back, and she looked different this way, or maybe she'd always looked this way, and he was just now letting himself notice it. He said he's been watching you since October. I know. He said, she stopped, started again. He said you haven't done a single thing he could fault. Silas waited. He didn't sound happy about it, Clara said, and there was something in her voice that was almost amusement, that lifted quality at the end of a sentence that's trying not to become a real laugh. That sounds about right, Silas said. She looked at him. The almost laughter faded into something more serious. Not sad, just real, level. The way she looked at things when she was deciding to be honest about them. He's not the reason I've been careful, she said. I want you to know that. I understand why he does what he does. But I'm not careful because of him. I'm careful because the last time I stopped being careful about who I let matter to me, it turned out to matter a great deal when that person was gone. Silas said nothing. I'm telling you that, Clara said, because I think you should know what you're working with. Before you decide, she stopped, looked at the pasture for a moment. Before you keep coming to the east fence. Silas leaned on the post. The post was solid under his arm. He'd replaced this one in January. He remembered replacing it. I know what I'm working with, he said. I'm not easy, she said. I didn't say you were. I have a child. I know. And a father who, Clara. He said it the same way he always said her name, without urgency. I know all of that. I've known it since the beginning. He paused. I'm still here. She looked at him for a long moment. The cottonwoods moved slightly in the light wind. Why? She said. The same word Gideon had used, but different in her mouth, said it, not a challenge, genuine inquiry. She really wanted to know. He thought about several answers. He chose the true one. Because Lily told me I found her, he said, and I think she might have been right about more than the canyon. Clara was very still for a moment. Then she looked away, toward the cottonwoods, and he could see the side of her face, and the way she pressed her lips together, and the way her chin moved in that small, controlled way that meant she was managing something. That was a terrible thing to say to me, she said. I know. Now I'm going to be thinking about that for the rest of the day. I expect so. She turned back to him. Her eyes were bright. Not wet exactly. She was not a woman who cried in front of people on purpose. But the brightness was there, and she wasn't hiding it. I have to go get Lily, she said. Okay. I'll be by on Wednesday. There's a section of my fence along the south boundary that might need looking at. He kept his face level. I'll see if I can get over there Wednesday afternoon. Don't put yourself out. No trouble. She looked at him for one more moment, just one. Silas, she said. Clara. It was not a meaningful exchange of words. There was no revelation in it, no declaration, nothing that could be pointed to later as the moment when something was officially decided. It was just names. Two people saying each other's names in the cold spring air at a fence line, with the cottonwoods barely beginning their change and the mud still soft from thaw and the rest of the valley going about its business around them. But Helen, who was at her window, where else would she be, watched Clara walk back to her truck, and she watched Silas watch Clara walk back to her truck. And she thought, there it is. There it has been, actually, for a long time. She turned from the window. She went to start supper, moving around the kitchen with the small, sure actions of a woman who knows exactly where everything is. And she thought about the way Gideon had said, I know she is, and I'm still afraid. And she thought about Silas in the equipment shed with a wrench in his hand saying, I'm just trying to be someone worth keeping. And she thought about Clara at the kitchen table with her working hands flat on the wood, saying he makes me feel like a person again. She thought about Thomas, who had been worth loving and was gone. She thought about the specific courage required to decide that the capacity for love was worth more than the protection of guarding against its loss. She thought about the fact that none of them, not Gideon, not Silas, not Clara, were going to be fine exactly. They were going to be human. They were going to make mistakes and misread each other and have mornings that were hard and evenings that didn't resolve. That was the part nobody put in the version of the story they told afterward. But they were going to try. She thought that might be the only honest definition of forward she'd ever found. The stove was warm, the kitchen smelled of coffee and whatever had been cooking since noon. Outside, the last light of the March afternoon was doing its best with what it had, cold still, uncertain still, but longer than it had been a month ago, and getting longer. Gideon came in from the barn. He stood at the kitchen doorway taking off his coat, and he looked at Helen and he said, in a voice that had been worked down to something simple, I think I've been unfair. Helen stirred the pot. I know, she said. I'm going to try to do better. I know that too. He hung up his coat. He washed his hands at the sink. He came and stood beside her at the stove and looked at what she was cooking and said nothing for a moment, just stood there, which was what Gideon did when he was finished with the hard part of something and needed to be in a normal place while he recovered from it. He told me he's staying, Gideon said. I'm not surprised. He said he's trying to be someone worth keeping. He paused. What kind of a man says something like that? Helen thought about the gray horse moving in careful circles, about the calf carried across a flooded creek in the dark, about an apple on a porch step, about imperfect BlackBerry labels written by someone who didn't usually write neatly, but tried anyway. The kind we don't get often enough, she said. Gideon stood there. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the light held on a little longer than it had the day before. The south boundary fence turned out to need more than looking at. Silas rode over on a Wednesday afternoon as he'd said he would, and Clara met him at the property line in her work coat with a thermos of coffee because the wind was still running cold, even though the calendar said April was close enough to touch. She'd already walked the fence that morning and found 3 posts heaved from the freeze-thaw cycle and a section of wire that had been pulled loose by something, a deer probably, or the elk that came through the lower pasture every winter, and treated fencing as a mild inconvenience rather than an actual barrier. She showed him where the problems were. He looked at them with the focused attention he brought to everything physical. Not hurried, not performing assessment, just actually looking. He crouched by the first heaved post and pushed at it with both hands to feel how far gone it was. And she watched him do it and thought, not for the first time, that there was something almost restful about being around a person who was genuinely present in whatever they were doing. Thomas had been like that. Different in every other way, but that quality, the quality of attention, had been the same. She hadn't let herself think that comparison before. She wasn't sure what it meant that she was thinking it now. She filed it away to look at later, when she was alone. 3 posts need pulling, Silas said, standing. Wire's not bad. I can splice it where it pulled. I can do the wire, Clara said. I've done it before. He looked at her. Not with the particular expression some men wore when a woman said she could handle something, the slightly skeptical expression that was really just social habit, but with the straightforward look of someone recalibrating a plan. Okay, he said. You take the wire. I'll pull posts. I wasn't asking permission. I know. I was agreeing with you. She looked at him for a moment. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of thaw and cold earth. Right, she said. Sorry. You don't have to apologize for... I know, she said, and she almost smiled. I still catch myself bracing sometimes for the argument that doesn't come. He didn't say anything for a moment. He handed her the wire cutters from his back pocket, which she took. What was he like? Silas said. Clara looked at him. Thomas, he said, carefully. You don't have to... No. She turned the wire cutters over in her hands. I don't mind. It's just, people don't ask. They talk around him like he was something that happened to me rather than someone I actually knew. She paused. He was funny. That's the first thing. He had this completely dry sense of humor that came out of nowhere, and half the time I'd be laughing before I understood what he'd said. She walked toward the pulled wire, and he followed. He was stubborn. Lord, he was stubborn. We had an argument once about the best way to stack firewood that went on for 3 days because neither of us would back down. A short, almost laugh. He was kind to Lily even before she was born, in all the ways you could be kind to someone who wasn't there yet. He planned for her. He thought about her. He was going to be a very good father. She crouched at the fence line and started examining the pulled section. He sounds like someone worth knowing, Silas said. He was. She found the break and started working. I'm not going to pretend the marriage was perfect. We were young, and we didn't always get it right, and there were months that were harder than I told anyone. But he tried. He kept trying. That counted for a lot. Silas had moved to the first heaved post and was working the ground bar around the base to loosen it. They worked in silence for a while. It was the kind of silence that had content to it, not uncomfortable, not empty, but full of the work and the wind and the specific quality of 2 people who had said something real and were letting it settle. I had someone too, Silas said. He wasn't looking at her. He was working the bar. Not married, but close to it. About 6 years ago. Clara looked up. Her name was Dee. She was from Wyoming. We were together 2 years. He worked the post free, and it came up slowly, the root end dark with wet earth. She wanted me to stop moving. I thought I wanted to stop moving. Turns out wanting to want something isn't the same as actually wanting it. What happened? She stopped waiting, which was the right thing for her to do. He set the post to the side. I don't say that without... It cost me. It cost her more. I knew that. I know it now. Clara had stopped working the wire. She was just watching him. He moved to the second post and started on the ground bar. I'm telling you that, he said, because you told me something true, and it seemed right to offer something back. He looked at her briefly. I'm not that person anymore, the one who couldn't stay. But I also can't prove that to you. You just have to watch and see. She was quiet for a long moment. That's an honest thing to say, she said finally. I try. Most men would have just told me they'd changed. Most men would be lying. She made a sound that was unambiguously a real laugh this time, sudden, unguarded, the laugh of someone who got caught off guard by something genuinely funny and didn't have time to manage it. She put her hand over her mouth almost immediately, which somehow made it more real. Silas looked at her with the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him. She went back to the wire. They worked through the afternoon until the wind picked up past the point of being comfortable, and by the time they finished all 3 posts and the wire splice, the light had gone that flat gray quality that meant rain before morning. She poured the last of the coffee from the thermos and handed him the cup, and he drank half and handed it back, which she finished, and it was an entirely unremarkable exchange that was somehow nothing like unremarkable. Thank you, she said. Your fence, he said. I just helped. She gathered her tools. At her truck, she stopped and turned around. Silas, she said, come for supper. On Friday. You don't need to bring anything. Just come. He looked at her. Lily will want to show you something, Clara said. She's been making something out of sticks and string that she's very serious about. She told me this morning it was for someone, but she wouldn't say who. The smallest thing happened in his expression. The smallest shift, the kind you'd miss if you weren't paying attention, or if you hadn't been watching someone long enough to know what his neutral looked like. Friday, he said. 6 o'clock. She got in the truck and drove home. She didn't tell Gideon about Friday dinner until Thursday evening. She waited until he'd had his supper and his coffee and had moved to his chair, which was when he was most at rest, the closest thing to settled that Gideon Whitmore ever got. Helen was in the kitchen. Clara sat on the arm of the sofa and looked at her father and said it plainly. I've invited Silas for supper tomorrow night. Gideon looked at her over his reading glasses. At your place, Clara added. He took the glasses off, folded them, set them on the side table with precision. All right, he said. Clara blinked. All right? That's what I said. You're not going to... Clara. Gideon looked at his hands, then at her. He looked tired in a way that was different from the tiredness of winter. Not the physical exhaustion of hard work, but the other kind, the kind that came from holding a position past the point where you still believed in it. I talked to him. I know, he told me. He said he was trying to be someone worth keeping. Clara said nothing. You know what I thought when he said that? Gideon said. What? I thought, Thomas never had to say that. He just was. He paused. And then I thought, Thomas never had to prove anything to me because I already knew him. I'd known him since he was 11 years old. He picked up his glasses again, turned them over. Silas doesn't have that. He hasn't got the history. So what he's got instead is what he does. What he shows me every day. He set the glasses down again. And what he's shown me is not nothing. Clara was very still. I'm not giving you my blessing, Gideon said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not there yet. But I'm also not... He stopped. I'm asking you to be careful. I'm always going to ask you to be careful. That's not going to change. But I'm not asking you to stop. Clara looked at her father for a long moment. She got up and crossed to his chair and kissed him on top of his head, which she hadn't done since she was about 12 years old. He went very still under it, the way he went still when he was moved and hadn't planned to be. Thank you, Daddy, she said. She went to help Helen in the kitchen. Gideon sat in his chair with his hands in his lap and looked at the wall across from him for a long time. Helen came to the kitchen doorway and looked at him. Don't say anything, he said. I wasn't going to say a word, she said. She went back to the kitchen. Matam. Friday supper was not a romantic occasion. It was, in the actual event, a fairly chaotic one. Lily had spent the afternoon constructing what she described as a house for her carved wooden horse, which was built out of sticks, twine, several pieces of cardboard, and an amount of tape that Clara suspected had been sourced from the entire roll in the kitchen drawer. It was structurally optimistic. Lily presented it to Silas within approximately 4 seconds of his arrival at the door, holding it up with both hands while explaining at length what each component was for. Silas took it and turned it over in his hands with complete seriousness. "The door works," Lily told him. There was a small hinged cardboard door attached with a piece of tape that did in fact swing open. "It does," he agreed. "I made it so the horse can go in and come out." "That's good design." "She needs a house," Lily said. "It gets cold." "Does she have a name?" Lily looked at him like this was obvious. "Her name is Margaret." "That's a good name for a horse." Lily took the house back and went to put it in position on the coffee table, where she'd clearly been planning its placement all afternoon, and Clara was standing in the kitchen doorway watching all of this with her arms folded across her chest and an expression that she was not quite managing. Silas looked at her. "Margaret," she said quietly. "Good name for a horse," he said. She turned back to the stove before he could see what her face did next. Supper was elk stew and bread that Clara had made herself, and that had come out well except for one corner of the loaf that was a little dark, which she'd cut off and put aside, and which Silas ate anyway when she wasn't watching. Lily talked for most of the meal about Margaret and her house and a dream she'd had about a blue dog and a girl at her playgroup named Avery who had declared that rabbits were better than horses, which Lily considered a position requiring extended refutation. Silas ate and listened and asked questions at exactly the right moments. Not the performative questions of someone trying to demonstrate engagement, but the genuine questions of someone who was actually tracking the conversation and wanted to know what came next. Clara watched this. After supper, Lily was supposed to go to bed and didn't want to, and made this known through a series of increasingly creative delaying tactics that included needing water, needing a different blanket, needing to tell Silas one more thing about Margaret, and needing to clarify something about the blue dog from the dream that she'd forgotten to mention at supper. Clara handled all of this with the patient firmness of a woman who had done this before and would do it again and had made her peace with how long it took. Silas stayed at the kitchen table and finished his coffee while the sounds of the bedtime negotiation moved down the hall, and he looked at the kitchen Clara had made her own, the practical efficiency of it, the things hung in specific places for specific reasons, the small details that accumulated into a picture of a life being lived deliberately. And he thought about what she'd said at the fence line that afternoon. About Thomas. About trying. I thought about what it took to keep trying after losing something that mattered. He thought he had some experience with that, just different in kind. Clara came back looking slightly worn around the edges, which was honest. "She's asleep," Clara said. I noticed the silence. She sat down across from him at the table, not performing ease, just sitting down because she was tired and her kitchen was a reasonable place to be tired in. "This was good," he said. "The supper. The bread was a little dark on one end. I ate that part." "I know you did." She looked at him. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Outside, the April night was cold and clear, and through the kitchen window the first stars were visible, which meant the clouds from earlier had moved on. "My father said he talked to you," she said. "He did. He said you told him what you wanted." "I told him some of it." She looked at him. "What's the rest of it?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. "I want to stop being the kind of person I was 6 years ago," he said. "The kind who could see what mattered and still find a reason to keep moving. I want to be someone Lily could count on. Not because she doesn't have people. She has you. She has your parents. She's not short on people. But because—" He stopped. Started again more carefully. "Because when she's 40 years old and she thinks about the people who showed up for her, I want to be in that number. I want to have been steady. I want to have been there." Clara's hands tightened slightly on the cup. "And you," he said. "I want—" He stopped again. He was not a man who said too much, and he wasn't going to start now, but he was also aware that the economy of words he usually operated by was a different tool than the one this moment required. "I want to know you. All the difficult parts. I want to earn the right to know what Thomas knew." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, which was unusual. He was reasonably good at reading her by now. That's a lot, she said. I know. I'm not, she pressed her lips together. I'm not able to promise you anything right now. I'm not at the place where I can say, I can't make that clear yet. I'm not asking for promises. Then what are you asking for? He looked at her. Time, he said. Just time. To keep showing up. To let you see whether it's real. She was quiet for a long moment. Okay, she said. Just that. One word. Quiet and small and absolutely solid. He nodded once. They sat in her kitchen for another hour, talking about things that were not what they'd just said, about the spring planting schedule, about whether the Hollands down the road were going to sell their north pasture, about a book Lily had memorized so completely she could recite it forward and backward at will, and did so without provocation. Ordinary things. The kind that accumulated. When he left, she stood at the door and he stood on the porch, and the night was cold and clear. Same time next Friday, she said. I'll be here, he said. He drove back to the ranch. Helen heard the truck come in just past 9 and said nothing, which was itself a kind of comment. What she said the next morning, over coffee, when she and Gideon were alone at the kitchen table was, he came back before 10. I know, Gideon said. I heard the truck. He was there 3 hours. Helen. I'm just noting it. Gideon wrapped both hands around his cup. He was not yet a man at peace with the situation, but he was a man who had decided to try to become one, which was the step before peace, and was usually the harder one. You knew about the supper before she told me. I had a feeling. You could have said something. I could have, Helen agreed. He looked at her. She looked back at him. I wanted to see if he'd mention it, Gideon said. Did he? No. Would you have preferred he did? Gideon thought about that. Genuinely thought about it, which was itself a change from the Gideon of October who had assigned the east fence and the frozen ground and the broken posts as tests. No, he said finally. I think, no. That's between him and Clara. Helen drank her coffee. He's putting up the north gate today, Gideon said. Is he? I didn't have to ask him twice. You didn't have to ask him once, Helen said. You mentioned it to Pete, and Pete mentioned it to him. Gideon blinked. Helen was looking at the window. He hears everything, she said. He just doesn't make noise about it. Watch. April opened into something almost generous. The mud dried out in stages, the ground firming up in the high places first, and then the low ones slowly following, and the ranch came back to itself in the way it did every spring. More space, more sound, more of everything. The horses got restless. The cattle moved differently. The days got long enough that you could start work early and still have light left in the evening, which changed the texture of a day significantly. The bay gelding, the one with the shoulder problem and the complicated opinions about saddle pads, had his first calm ride under Silas on a Thursday afternoon. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't transform. He just moved correctly for 20 minutes, soft through the shoulder, willing through the turn, no bracing, no protest. And Silas brought him back to the barn and took the saddle off and spent a few minutes just standing with him in the quiet of the stall. Pete was watching from the fence. There it is, Pete said. Took a while, Silas said. Best things do. Silas looked at him. Pete smiled with the side of his face that moved and went back to what he was doing. Opa. The conversation Gideon had been avoiding happened on a Tuesday in the last week of April. He'd been avoiding it in the specific way of a man who knew it needed to happen and was waiting for the right version of himself to be available for it. The version that had processed enough, worked through enough, come far enough from the original position that the conversation would go where it needed to go rather than where his fear might take it. He found Silas at the north gate, which was in and solid, the work clean and level. It's good work, Gideon said. Silas ran a hand along the top rail. Post is straight, latch closes clean. I can see that. They stood at the gate for a moment. The north pasture spread out ahead of them, and the mountains beyond the valley were still snow-capped, but the snow line had moved up since January, a visual measure of how much time had passed. I need to ask you something, Gideon said. Go ahead. Gideon put his hands in his coat pockets. He looked at the mountains rather than at Silas, which was a concession, a way of making the conversation slightly less direct than it would have been otherwise, and both of them knew it. If what you and Clara are, if it becomes something, he said, if it becomes the kind of something that requires a decision, He paused. What do you plan to do? Silas said, You mean will I stay? I mean, what do you plan to do? I plan to stay, Silas said, flat and certain. No decoration. Gideon looked at him now. My daughter has been through something that I would not wish on anyone, he said. My granddaughter doesn't have a father. You understand that these are not light things. No, sir. If you stay, you're not staying for a season. You're not staying until something calls you down the road. If you stay, you're... He stopped. His jaw worked slightly. You're part of this. You're part of what happens to these people I love. Silas looked at him steadily. I understand that. Do you? I've understood it since November, Silas said, when Clara told me what Thomas was like, what kind of man he was. I understood then that I wasn't walking into something light, that there was weight here, history, people who'd already been through the loss of someone who mattered. He paused. That didn't make me want to leave. That made me want to make sure I was serious about staying before I let it go any further. Gideon was quiet. I was serious, Silas said. I am serious. The wind moved across the north pasture, bending the new grass in long, slow waves from west to east. Gideon looked out at it. Thomas liked this pasture, he said. Not quite to Silas, to the air between them, to the pasture, to the version of that young man who had stood in this same spot and looked at these same mountains. He used to say the light was different here, in the afternoon. He paused. I could never see it. Helen said she could. Silas looked at the north pasture in the late afternoon light. The angle's different up here, he said. You're a little higher than the south and east. Sun hits straight on instead of at an angle. Gideon looked at him. Thomas was right, Silas said. The light is different. Something in Gideon's face moved. Just slightly. The way a thing moves when pressure has been applied to it for a long time and is finally being released. A small reconfiguration of what had been held too tight. I didn't say anything. Silas didn't say anything either. They stood at the north gate in the different afternoon light and looked at the pasture and the mountains, and neither of them needed the silence to end. After a while, Gideon said, You'll come for Sunday dinner. It was not a question. Yes, sir, Silas said. Helen makes a roast. There's always too much of it. I'll be there. Gideon nodded once. He turned from the gate and walked back toward the house. His gait was the slightly stiff gait of a man in his 60s who had worked hard his whole life and carried the record of it in his body. And watching him go, Silas thought he looked more like a man than a wall for the first time since October. He looked at the north gate he'd built, ran his hand along the top rail again. It was straight. The latch closed clean. It would hold. Clara heard about the Sunday dinner invitation from Helen, who told her over the phone on Wednesday with a brevity that contained multitudes. Your father invited Silas for Sunday dinner, Helen said. Clara was quiet for a moment. He did. Roast. He mentioned there's always too much. He says that every week. I know. Clara sat down at her kitchen table. Mom, she said, which she didn't often say. She'd gotten out of the habit of it somewhere in her 20s, when she'd shifted to Helen the way adults shifted to their parents' first names. And she didn't always remember she'd done it until a moment came along that required something older and more basic. I know, Helen said, gently. The gentleness she didn't deploy often, kept for situations that required the real version. He's really trying, Clara said. He is. It costs him. I can see it costing him. It does, Helen said. But he's doing it anyway. That's what matters. Clara pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes for a moment. Not crying, just receiving something. The way you had to be physically still sometimes to actually receive something that was being given. Bring Lily on Sunday, Helen said. She can show me the horse house she's been working on. Silas mentioned there was a horse house. He told you about that? He mentioned it. He said the door worked. Clara made a sound. It does work, she said. I know it does, Helen said. Margaret needs a door she can use. That's just good design. Clara started laughing and couldn't stop for a moment. The kind of laughing that had pressure behind it from things that weren't quite laughter. And Helen let her do it without comment, which was the right thing. Sunday, Clara said, when she could. 6 o'clock, Helen said. Your father will behave himself. Will he? Probably mostly, Helen said. She hung up. Clara sat at her kitchen table for a while. Through the window, The April evening was settling into something almost warm, the kind of warm that wasn't quite reliable yet, but was making an effort. The cottonwoods at the south end of the property had gone properly green while she wasn't paying attention, the way trees did when you weren't watching for it. One day bare, next day green, no gradual middle to speak of. Lily came in from the backyard with dirt on both knees and an expression of complete satisfaction. "I found a worm," she announced. "Did you?" "A big one. I put it back." "Good." Lily climbed up onto the chair across from her and looked at her with the direct assessment of a child who tracked adult emotional states as a practical survival skill. "Are you okay?" Clara looked at her daughter, at the dirt on her knees and the satisfaction on her face and the absolute present tense completeness of her. "Yes," she said, "I'm really okay." "Are we going to Grandma's on Sunday?" "We are." "Is Silas coming?" Clara looked at her. "Yes," she said. Lily nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already known. "Good," she said. "I need to tell him about the worm." She climbed down from the chair and went to wash her hands, narrating the worm story to herself as she went. And Clara sat at the table in the April evening light and listened to her daughter's voice moving through the small rooms of their house, and thought about time, and about what you did with it, and about the particular courage of deciding that it was worth something. She thought it was. She was almost certain it was. She got up and started supper. Sunday dinner was loud in a way the Whitmore house hadn't been loud in a long time. Lily arrived with Margaret's house under one arm and a drawing she'd made for Helen under the other, and she presented both items at the door before she'd fully crossed the threshold, explaining the drawing first because she felt the context was important. It was, as far as Helen could determine, a picture of 5 people standing in a field with what appeared to be a very large sun and a horse that was approximately the same size as the people, which Lily confirmed was Margaret, and which was significantly larger than Margaret's actual dimensions but represented, Lily explained, how important Margaret was. Helen put it on the refrigerator while Lily was still talking. Gideon stood in the kitchen doorway, watching his granddaughter conduct her presentation, and he did not say much, but his face did something that it did not usually do in the presence of guests. It relaxed. Not completely. Gideon's face was not built for complete relaxation, but enough that he looked like a man at home rather than a man at a post. Silas arrived at 6:15, which was not 6 o'clock, and he came in with his hat already off and a slight hesitation at the door. That was not quite nervousness, but was the honest acknowledgement that he was entering something that mattered, and he knew it. Lily looked up from the corner where she'd been re-explaining Margaret's house to Pete, who had been invited for dinner because Helen said the table had room, and Pete said he could be there in 10 minutes, which meant he'd been ready since 5. "You're late," Lily told Silas. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." "That's okay," Lily said, returning immediately to Pete in the horse house, the matter fully resolved in her estimation. Clara, coming from the kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder, caught Silas's eye across the room. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since that Wednesday in March at the fence line, with the particular quality of the tension that she'd stopped trying to talk herself out of responding to somewhere around the 3rd Friday supper. She looked back at him in a way she also wasn't managing anymore. "Helen needs someone to carry the roast," Clara said. "I can do that," he said. She handed him the oven mitts and went back to the kitchen, and he followed, and Gideon watched this small domestic sequence from his chair and said nothing, and the nothing he said was a different quality of nothing than it had been in November. The dinner was full, not elegant. A big table with mismatched chairs pulled in from other rooms, Pete eating with his left hand, because he'd banged the right one on something that afternoon and hadn't mentioned it until Helen noticed, Lily inserting herself into every conversational thread with the democratic insistence of someone who had no sense that any topic was not also her topic. The roast was good. The bread was good. There was too much of everything, which was the point. Gideon asked Silas about the North Pasture fence line, and Silas gave him a real answer, not a performing for the father answer, a genuine assessment of what was holding and what would need attention before winter, and Gideon listened with the look he wore when he was actually learning something from someone, rather than just waiting for them to finish talking. Pete told a story about a fence repair he'd done in 1987 that had gone wrong in 4 consecutive ways, each one caused by the attempt to fix the previous one, and the story got funnier with each complication until even Gideon was laughing in the contained way he laughed, which was mostly his eyes and a compression of his lips that wasn't quite a smile but was something close. Lily fell asleep at the table, not gradually. The way children did it, fully present one moment, gone the next, her head drooping until it was resting on her folded arms, with the boneless certainty of someone who had decided this was where sleep was happening and the location was non-negotiable. Nobody woke her. Clara put a sweater over her shoulders, and the conversation continued around her, quieter. And there was something in the image of the small sleeping child at the big table, surrounded by adults, who were all, in their various complicated ways, making an effort. There was something in that image that settled into the room like a thing that was going to stay. After dinner, Pete helped Helen with dishes because that was what Pete did and nobody argued with it. And Gideon took his coffee to the sitting room because that was what Gideon did. And Clara and Silas stood at the kitchen counter with the particular purposelessness of two people who didn't want to leave the room they were in but didn't have a task to justify staying in it. "Your father laughed," Silas said. "I know, I wasn't sure his face could do that." Pete's story was funny. Pete's story was terrifying. That fence could have killed someone. But it didn't. But it didn't, she agreed. She looked at her hands on the counter. He was close enough that she was aware of it without it being a thing she had to think about, which was its own kind of information. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Okay. I've been thinking about what you said. In October. When you told Lily you were scared when you saw her near the drop-off." He was quiet. "You didn't have to tell her that," Clara said. "You could have said no, you were fine, everything was under control. Most men would have. Especially to a 4-year-old who wasn't going to know the difference." She paused. "But you told her the truth, that you were scared. And then you said she was brave anyway, even though she said she wasn't scared and she was just looking for her rabbit." She looked up at him. "I've been thinking about that for 7 months." He was looking at her steadily. "I think I was scared too," she said. "Not of you, of what you might be, of what it might mean if you were real." She turned to face him more directly. "Because if you were real, then I had to be real about it. And being real about it meant being willing to lose something again, and I was not sure I was willing to do that." "Are you sure now?" he said. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. "No," she said. "I'm not sure I'll ever be sure, but I'm willing to try, and I think that's what I've got." He reached across the counter and put his hand over hers. Just that. His hand on hers, both of them looking at it. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." From the sitting room, Gideon's chair creaked. From the kitchen, Pete said something to Helen that made her make the sound that was her version of laughing, the low, efficient sound of someone who found things funny but didn't see the need to perform it. Lily slept at the table under the sweater. Silas's hand was warm and calloused and slightly rough from the winter's work, and Clara turned her hand over and held it, and they stood in the Whitmore kitchen on a Sunday evening in late April, and did not say anything else because there wasn't anything else that needed saying right then. Gideon asked Silas to walk the north pasture with him 2 Sundays later. It was the kind of request that had a shape Clara recognized, the shape of her father doing something difficult by dressing it as something ordinary. Walking the pasture was a real thing that needed doing. It was also a fence that had nothing wrong with it, because Silas had built it, and Silas built things to last. They went after dinner while Clara and Helen cleaned up, and Lily conducted a private ceremony in the yard involving Margaret's house and several pine cones she'd arranged with clear intentionality. The north pasture in May was a different place than it had been in April. The grass was real now, not just the suggestion of it, deep and green in the low places where the snowmelt had pooled and fed it. The mountains were starting to show their actual color beneath the retreating snow line, gray and brown, and the dark green of the timber that started about 2/3 up. They walked the fence line, the way men walked fence lines, checking the posts, the wire, the set of the staples, making the inspection a conversation with the materials rather than with each other, which made the actual conversation easier. "I've been thinking about what you said," Gideon said. "In the equipment shed. In March." "What part?" "The part about wanting to be someone Lily could count on." He checked a post. "Solid." "And about wanting to earn the right to know what Thomas knew." Silas didn't say anything. "Thomas was 23 when he married Clara," Gideon said. "I thought he was too young. I told him so. He told me that age wasn't the relevant question, which I thought at the time was a young man's argument, the kind you make when you don't have enough history to know better." He paused at a gate, checked the latch. "He was right. I was wrong. Age wasn't the relevant question." "What's the relevant question?" Silas said. Whether you're the kind of person who stays when staying is hard. Gideon looked at him. I've watched you since October. I gave you every reason to go. Cold work, bad hours, assignments designed to wear you out. He said the last part without apology, just fact. You stayed. I had reasons to stay. I know what your reasons are, Gideon said. I'm not talking about reasons. I'm talking about what you did when the reasons got complicated. When I was in the way. When it wasn't easy. He looked at the mountains. You stayed quiet. You worked. You let me come to it in my own time. He paused. That took something. I'm not sure I could have done it. Silas looked at him. I'm telling you, Gideon said carefully, like each word was being placed with intention, that I was wrong about you, from the beginning. I put you in the category of man I've seen before, the kind who comes through and does damage without meaning to, because they were never really there to begin with. And you're not that. You are not that man. I was, Silas said. 6 years ago I was closer to that than I'd like. People change. Some do, some don't. It's not automatic. No, Gideon agreed. It's not. He started walking again. Silas walked beside him. My son-in-law loved my daughter. He was a good man and he loved her and he died anyway. And I spent 14 months being angry about that in a way I couldn't aim at anything because there was nothing to aim at. There was just absence, just the shape of where he used to be. He was quiet for a moment. I put that anger on you before you'd done anything to deserve it because you were present and he wasn't, and my mind needed somewhere to put what it was carrying. The wind moved through the north pasture grass. I understand that, Silas said. I'm not asking for understanding, Gideon said. I'm telling you it wasn't right. And I'm telling you, He stopped walking, turned to face Silas fully, which was something Gideon did rarely, and only when he meant what came next to be received without ambiguity. I'm telling you that if you want to ask Clara something, you have my support. Not just my permission, my support. Silas looked at him for a long moment. The mountains behind Gideon were blue-gray in the afternoon light, the particular color they turned when the sun was past its height and moving toward the valley's west wall. I appreciate that, Silas said. Don't appreciate it, Gideon said. Just don't make me regret it. He started walking again. Silas walked beside him. After a moment, Silas said, The post at the northeast corner is going to need checking before fall. The ground's soft there. Might heave again. I see it, Gideon said. I can get to it in August. July would be better. July, then. They finished the fence line in the late afternoon light and walked back toward the ranch without saying anything else. And the not saying anything had the quality of men who have finished something significant and are letting it rest. He asked her on a Thursday. Not Friday, which would have been the obvious choice given their history with Fridays, but Thursday, which was an ordinary day, which turned out to be exactly right. He'd come to fix a leak in the Ashford roof, a small one, not urgent, but the kind that became urgent if you waited. And Lily was at Marin's for the afternoon and Clara was inside working on accounts when she heard him on the roof and went out to bring him coffee and stood in the yard looking up at him. He came down when the repair was done, and she handed him the coffee, and he drank it standing in the yard in the May afternoon with the smell of the repaired shingles and the warm coffee and the particular quality of light that May had in this valley. Soft, lengthened, almost generous. He handed the cup back. He looked at her. He said, I want to ask you something. She looked at him. He didn't dress it up. He wasn't a man who dressed things up, and she wouldn't have trusted it if he had. I want to marry you, he said. I want to be Lily's father in every way that matters. I want to be part of what happens to your family. I want to be in this valley when I'm 60 and when I'm 70, and I want you to be who I'm here with. He stopped. I know that's a lot to ask. I know you didn't plan any of this. I know Thomas is part of this conversation, whether we say his name or not, and I'm not asking you to be done with that. I'm asking you to let me be here alongside it, alongside all of it. Clara stood in her yard in the May light. She thought about an apple on a porch step in November, about imperfect blackberry labels and a fence line in the December cold, about a Christmas Eve sidewalk and the specific loneliness of a holiday season when the person who was supposed to be there wasn't, about a pie with thick crust left at a fence post, about Lily saying you found me with the certainty of someone setting the historical record straight. She thought about Thomas, who had been real and present and worth loving, and who was gone, and who she would not stop grieving, not completely, not ever. and who she thought, she believed, with the careful and hard-won belief of someone who had examined it, would not have wanted her stopped. She thought about the specific courage of trying again. She thought it was actually not courage. She thought it was something quieter than courage. More like decision. The decision that the future was worth entering even though you couldn't see what was in it. The decision that someone's steady presence over 8 months of ordinary days added up to something worth saying yes to. Yes, she said. Silas looked at her. Yes, she said again, clearly, without qualification. He closed the distance between them, and she stepped into it, and he put his arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was right. Some moments needed words, and some needed the absence of them, and this was the second kind. When she stepped back, her eyes were bright. Lily is going to be very serious about this, Clara said. I know. She's going to have opinions about everything. I expect she will. She's going to want to tell Margaret immediately. He almost smiled. The full version, not the almost. It changed his face significantly, and she thought she was going to need more time to get used to it, which meant she was going to have more time, which meant she'd said yes, which she'd already known, but which kept arriving in small waves of its own reality. I'll go with you when you tell her, he said. She's going to ask if you're going to live with us. What will you tell her? Clara looked at him. That's the plan. He nodded once. She went inside to call Helen, which she needed to do before she could properly hold the information herself. And Silas stood in the yard for a moment and looked at the property, the house, the barn, the fence line he'd repaired, the gate post he'd replaced in December, the roof he'd just fixed, and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a long time. Not relief exactly, more like recognition. The recognition of having arrived somewhere. He'd been in a lot of places. He'd driven away from a lot of them without looking in the mirror. He knew the difference between a place you were passing through and a place that was becoming yours. And the difference was not the place. The difference was what you decided to do with your feet. He'd decided. He already had, months ago. He was just now catching up to his own certainty. Helen's voice on the phone was not emotional, which meant she was very emotional. Well, she said. Well, Clara said. A pause. I'll tell your father, Helen said. Mom, he'll want to hear it from me. Trust me on this. Clara trusted her on this. She stood in her kitchen holding the phone after Helen hung up and looked around the room that was hers, the accounts on the table, the coffee cups still out from this morning, Margaret's house on the windowsill where Lily had moved it 2 weeks ago, and it had stayed because there was no reason to move it back. And she thought about how a kitchen could be both a room you were in and the specific record of a life you were building, all at the same time. She thought Thomas would have liked him. She didn't know that. She couldn't know that. But she thought it, and she let herself think it, and it didn't break anything. It just sat there alongside everything else. A presence rather than an absence. The way people who were gone sometimes settled into being, not lost exactly, but changed in their location. She went outside to see if Silas needed more coffee. He didn't, but he accepted it anyway. Helen told Gideon in the sitting room before supper. She sat down across from him and folded her hands in her lap and said, Silas asked Clara to marry him today. Gideon looked at her. She said yes, Helen said. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. He looked at the floor and the particular sequence of a man who is deciding which of the several things happening inside him is the one he's going to allow to the surface. He asked me 2 Sundays ago, Gideon said finally, for my support. Helen stared at him. When we walked the north pasture, Gideon said. He didn't ask, not directly. He said he wanted to ask Clara something. I told him he had my support. You knew, Helen said, for 2 weeks. I wanted to see if he'd actually do it. Gideon Whitmore. I wasn't going to stop him. That is not... She stopped, looked at him. You are impossible. I know, he said. Are you angry? She looked at him for a long moment. No, she said, but I reserve the right to be later. He almost smiled. She didn't give him the satisfaction of smiling back, but she reached over and put her hand on his knee and left it there. Are you all right? She said. He thought about it seriously. I think so, he said. I thought it would be like the other thing, losing Thomas. I thought it would feel like that again. And? It doesn't. He sounded mildly surprised by his own answer. It feels like something coming in, not replacing, just different in kind. Helen looked at her husband, who had been afraid since October and had slowly, painfully, across 8 months of ordinary days, worked his way toward something that looked like trust, and she thought, this is who he is underneath the fortress. This was always who he was. He's a good man, she said. I know, Gideon said. I've known it for a while. I just needed to be sure. And now? I'm sure. He picked up her hand from his knee and held it, which he didn't do often, and they sat in the sitting room in the May evening with the windows open to let the warm air through, and outside the light was doing the long, generous thing it did in this valley in late spring, stretching itself across the fields until it seemed like it wasn't going to end. They were married on a Saturday in late June, under the cottonwood trees at the south end of the Whitmore East pasture. Helen had suggested the location, and nobody had disagreed with her, because the location was right, and everyone who knew this valley knew it. The cottonwoods were full in June, their leaves that particular green that was almost silver when the wind moved through them, and the grass below was deep, and the mountains beyond were their summer color, vivid, close-seeming, the way they got when the air was clear. There was no ceremony to speak of. A county judge named Harriet, who had known Gideon for 20 years and had opinions about almost everything, but kept them to herself in professional contexts. 30 people, maybe, from the valley, neighbors, the Hollands from the road. Ray Dubois, who had started this whole chain of events by mentioning to Gideon that he'd seen 2 people talking at a fence line, and who stood at the back of the gathering looking pleased with himself in a way he probably wasn't aware of. Pete stood next to Dev, both of them in clean shirts that showed evidence of recent ironing in the specific imprecise way of men who didn't iron things often, but had made the effort. Lily stood beside Clara in a yellow dress she had chosen herself after considerable deliberation, holding a small bunch of wildflowers she'd picked that morning from the east pasture with Helen's help. She was, as Clara had predicted, very serious about all of it. She stood straight and held her flowers and watched the proceedings with the focused attention of someone who understood that this was important, even if she couldn't have explained every reason why. When Harriet got to the part where she asked Silas if he would take Clara as his wife, Lily said, quietly but audibly, "He will." A ripple of laughter moved through the gathering. Silas looked down at her. "She's right," he said. More laughter. The easy kind, the kind that had warmth in it. Clara was trying not to laugh and not succeeding, and her eyes were bright, and her chin was doing the thing it did when she was managing something large. And she was holding Lily's hand and Silas's hand, and she thought, this is real. This is actually happening. She thought, I said yes on a Thursday in my yard over coffee and roof tar, and now I'm standing under the cottonwood trees and it's real. She thought, Thomas. She thought it the way she'd learned to think it, not as grief's emergency, not as the first country panic of loss, but as the thought of someone she had loved who was not here and whom she still loved and would always love and who existed now alongside this moment rather than in opposition to it. She had not replaced him. You didn't replace people. You carried them forward into the new country, and the new country was strange and you couldn't always see it clearly, and some days you still stumbled over the shape of what was missing, but you kept going because the alternative was staying still forever. And staying still forever was its own kind of death. She kept going. She was here, under the cottonwoods, in the June light, with her daughter's hand in one hand and this man's hand in the other, and she was here. Harriet finished. Silas kissed her, and someone, Pete probably, made a sound of approval, and Lily said, "Okay, that's enough of that," which broke into another wave of laughter that carried all the way across the east pasture to the fence line and the mountains beyond. Gideon shook Silas's hand. Not a formal shake, not a performance. He took Silas's hand and held it a moment, the grip firm and dry and deliberate, and looked at him straight. "You're family now," he said. "That means I can say what I think." "You were doing that already," Silas said. Gideon almost smiled. "Fair enough." He held the handshake a moment longer. "Welcome." He let go and moved away, back to Helen, who was standing with Clara and Lily, and was, for possibly the first time Silas had observed, not watching everything from a position of assessment. She looked like someone who was just present. Her hand on Clara's arm, Lily leaning against her side, the afternoon light on all of them. He stood and looked at it. His family, he supposed. New word for a feeling he'd been building toward for 8 months without knowing what to call it. Pete appeared at his elbow. Nice fence, Pete said, gesturing at the east line. You helped with that section, Silas said. I know. I'm complimenting my own work. Silas looked at him. Pete drank from his cup. You did good, he said, without further decoration. Thanks, Pete. Don't make a thing of it. Pete moved away toward the food table, which Ray Dubois had already located and was making productive use of. Lily found Silas 20 minutes later, pulling on his sleeve with the insistence of someone who had been waiting an appropriate interval and felt the interval had now passed. Are you coming to live with us? She said. Yes, he said. Is Margaret's house going to fit? He thought about the small cardboard and stick construction currently residing on the kitchen windowsill. I think we can make it work. Lily nodded, satisfied. Good. She looked at him for a moment with those serious, considering eyes. Are you my dad now? The question landed with the weight of something dropped from a significant height. He crouched down so he was at her level. This was a 4-year-old. You didn't give a 4-year-old a qualified answer, a considered adult answer full of appropriate uncertainty. You also didn't lie to her, because she would know, and because she deserved better than that. If you want me to be, he said. I'd like to be. Lily looked at him. Okay, she said, matter of fact. The way she'd said you found me, like the decision had been obvious for some time and she was simply confirming it for the record. She went back to her flowers. Silas stood up. Helen was watching from across the gathering. She'd seen the exchange. Of course she had. She'd been watching from windows and doorways for 8 months, and she wasn't going to stop now. She caught his eye. She nodded once. He nodded back. The summer settled the valley back into its ordinary rhythms, which were not ordinary at all once you started paying attention to them. Silas moved to the Ashford place in July, after a week of transporting the modest sum of his possessions, which fit, with room to spare, in the bed of the truck, and which said something about a life spent traveling light. He kept his position at the Whitmore Ranch, which made practical sense and which Gideon handled with a straightforwardness that was new, or rather was the version of Gideon that had been there all along but had needed the right circumstances to surface. The two properties, which had always been neighboring, became something more like connected. A fence mended here carried knowledge about the fence on the other side. A problem with the water table on the Ashford South pasture had a solution from the Whitmore East pasture that Gideon had worked out in 1998 and still remembered. Small practical economies, the kind that accumulated over time into something that looked like collaboration. Lily started calling Silas Dad in October, not with ceremony, not with a conversation leading up to it. She simply used it one morning at breakfast, asking if Dad could pass the butter, and then looked up when nobody immediately responded because both Clara and Silas had gone briefly still, and said, What? Nothing, Clara said. She passed the butter herself and looked at her coffee cup and did not look at Silas. He passed Lily the butter anyway because she'd asked, and Lily said thank you and went back to her toast, and the morning continued, and that was that. That evening, after Lily was in bed, Clara and Silas sat at the kitchen table with the particular quiet of the end of a day that had been significant in ways neither of them had prepared for. She just decided, Clara said. She does that. She decided you were hers in the canyon, Clara said, 7 months before anyone else figured it out. He looked at her. She's smarter than all of us, Clara said. She is, he agreed. Clara reached across the table and took his hand. The same gesture he'd made in April at the Whitmore kitchen counter, returned now in her own kitchen, her own table, their kitchen now, their table. Thank you, she said. For what? For finding her in the canyon. She looked at him. And for everything that came after. For being patient with my father. For fixing things without being asked. For the apple. She paused. I knew it was you, with the apple. From the beginning. He was quiet for a moment. I thought you might. Why didn't you say anything? Because it wasn't about whether you knew. It was about doing it. She looked at him for a long moment. That's the thing about you, she said. That's the whole thing right there. He looked back at her. The apple, she said. The labels. The calf in the wire. The gatepost. The fence. She shook her head slightly. You just keep doing the thing. You don't wait for anyone to notice. You don't need anyone to see it. You just do it. Most things need doing whether or not someone's watching, he said. I know. That's what I'm saying. She tightened her hand around his. Most people only do the thing when someone's watching. You do it anyway. That's not common, Silas. I want you to know I know it's not common. He said nothing for a moment. I had a long time to practice, he said. Being invisible. Doing things in places where nobody knew me. It started because I was running from something, and then it became, he stopped, found the right word. It became habit, and then it became who I was. And somewhere in there I stopped knowing which was which. Which is it now? He thought about Lily at the breakfast table asking for the butter, about the north pasture gate he'd built so it would last, about a calf carried across a flooded creek in the dark. It's who I am, he said. Clara held his hand. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the October night pressed at the windows the way October nights did in this valley, firmly, with intent, the cold already practicing for winter. But the house held against it, the way a well-built thing held. Not effortlessly, just held, mossam. Helen stood at her kitchen window on a morning in November, 1 year to the month from the storm that had brought a stranger out of the eastern tree line with a frightened child in his arms. She had her coffee. The morning was clear and cold, and the frost was on the grass in the intricate patterns that frost made in this valley, the ones that disappeared by 9 o'clock and were different every day, unrepeatable. Across the east pasture, movement. She watched. Silas, coming up from the barn at the Ashford place, leading the gray. Clara, coming out of the house with 2 cups of coffee. Lily, running out the door behind her without a coat, being intercepted by Silas, who caught her with one arm without breaking stride and draped his jacket over her shoulders in a movement so practiced she thought, he's been doing that for months. That's not new. That's already how they move. The 3 of them stood by the gray for a moment. Clara handed Silas his coffee. Lily was apparently telling them both something very important, gesturing with both hands, the jacket sliding off one shoulder and being resettled by Clara without Lily noticing. Helen watched this. She thought about what she'd seen from this window over the years. 35 years of mornings. The accumulation of ordinary days that added up to a life. Not in the dramatic moments, not in the remembered stories, but in the Tuesdays. The Fridays. The November mornings when the frost was different from the day before and would be different again tomorrow. She thought about a man who fixed things without being asked. She thought about a woman who made a pie with imperfect crust and left it at a fence line. She thought about a little girl who had chased a rabbit into the rocks and had been found, and who had known immediately, with the clear-eyed certainty of someone not yet old enough to doubt her own perceptions, that the person who found her was going to matter. She was right. She'd been right all along. Helen Whitmore had been watching people from this window for 35 years. She had her catalog. She knew the difference between people who were good in the moments that required it and people who were good in all the moments between. What she'd learned in 35 years of watching was that the second kind was the only kind that actually mattered. The heroic moment was an accident of circumstance. Any person, with enough adrenaline and enough stakes, might do the right thing in a crisis. The question was never the crisis. The question was Tuesday morning. The question was the apple on the step. The question was going back to do the calf before you let anyone look at your arm. The question was whether you were still the same person when nobody was watching. Silas Boone had answered that question every single day for a year, in full view of a woman who noticed everything and said less than she knew. She picked up her coffee. Across the pasture, Lily was climbing up on the fence rail with Silas's hand steady under her elbow, and Clara was watching, and the gray was patient, and the frost was already beginning to melt in the places where the morning sun reached the grass, disappearing without announcement, the way small, beautiful things did, unrepeatable, already being replaced by tomorrow's version. Helen turned from the window. She went to start breakfast. Gideon would be in from the barn in 20 minutes. The coffee needed freshening. There was work to do, the way there was always work to do, the way there would always be work to do, and that was fine. That was the whole thing, actually, not the arrival at the destination, the work that kept you in motion toward it. She'd always known that. She was glad, this particular November morning, that other people were finally learning it